lesson, we're going to look at, so today, for our class, we're going to look at Joseph. And then for the lesson, we're going to look at Mary, which Mary's a little bit more fun than Joseph in terms of what is said. But a couple of things before we get into this that I did want to remind us is at the outset, when you look at obviously Matthew through John, and these are the things that just are very, very fascinating to me, that they are written to different audiences for different purposes. And so Matthew, it seems to be understood, is written to Jews for a Jewish outcome. And so his intention is he's got a lot of Jewish stuff in his book, in his account. And then when you get to Luke, Luke seems to be written more to Gentiles, and so there's not nearly as much Jewishness in his book as there is for Matthew. And then the second thing is that, at least I find very interesting, is, and I've stated this a couple times over the years, that the Bible as a whole is written for us, but not to us. And so what that generally means is there's going to be a lot of things in here that were written to this audience that we either are totally ignorant of, we got to do some background and some study on it, because we don't know kind of, what's happening in the situation. But this audience did. They picked up on this stuff very quickly. So with that in mind, looking at Matthew chapter 1, and we're going to begin in verse 18. And we're going to begin there because the first 17 verses are genealogies, which were quite important to this group of people. How many of you enjoy genealogies? Anybody? Okay, cool. My mother-in-law does a lot, and I don't dislike him. I just, for whatever reason, don't connect for me. And my dad had a lot about his side of the family. So the first 18 verses have to do with, or 17 rather, genealogy. So I don't know why it fascinates me, but it's interesting that Matthew hits Joseph and Luke hits Mary, but neither one do the other. And you guys remember how Mark starts? Mark doesn't hit any of it. Mark goes right to the baptism of Jesus and John the Baptist. And then John does what? How does John begin? In the beginning. Yeah, he starts with, doesn't hit the birth, doesn't hit John the Baptist in that sense. He goes to the beginning and who Jesus is and what he came for. And then he goes right in chapter 2 to the changing of the water to wine. So John has an entirely different approach to the narrative of Jesus. So verse 18, this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, a messenger of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. So at the outset here, one of the things before we get to this point, imagine for Mary as she, however they find out that she's pregnant, and then Joseph find out that she is pregnant. Can you imagine initially that environment between the both of them? Because they're not married yet. Whatever you call an engagement that they have. And now she finds out she's pregnant. And Joseph finds out she's pregnant. And what do they for sure know? It's not Joseph. Because they hadn't done anything yet. And so, no doubt, the possible public disgrace, the frustration possibly of Joseph, and in fact, he did not want to expose her to public disgrace, so he was going to cut off the engagement quietly. And so, quite an interesting thing here as we, especially during this time, have this, the nativity scene and all these thoughts about this moment. And yet imagine Joseph finding out that she's pregnant. And maybe the conversation that they have. Her maybe trying to convince him, haven't been with the man, and all of the processes that take place. And then as Joseph has this dream, or possibly this vision from this messenger. Yeah.
It is kind of a curious thought that why didn't the
angel? Yeah, she's going to be. Yeah.
Why do you have to, because if she and I were engaged, if she would have
Yeah.
been pregnant,
Yeah.
I'd have been thinking, okay, she's on me.
Right.
What's going on here? There would have been this whole big stir up.
Yeah.
And I think that's neat.
Yeah.
It says that
Yeah, that's interesting.
the angel went to Joseph.
Yeah.
It's curious as to
Yeah. Great point. Very much so. And in fact, that kind of connected the dots also, that she was found to be pregnant. How? By the Holy Spirit. And I haven't done a whole lot of study or research on this. I don't know what, I know what I read whenever I read those two terms, but I don't know what they read whenever, because you have the Spirit in Genesis 1 hovering over the face of the deep, and you have it in some other places, but she's pregnant through the Holy Spirit. And if you are not a Christian, if you do not have a Bible background, what in the world does that mean? Something that doesn't matter anywhere, but I just find it cool. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant. So, guess what the word pregnant is in the Greek? We get our word gastrology from this term. It's the term gastro, it's stomach, which is obviously where, generally the baby is. But the word pregnant doesn't mean with child. The word pregnant is the word gastro, which is where we get our, stomach, our gastrology. Anyway, I just found that to be funny. So she is pregnant through the Holy Spirit. And so Joseph wanted to, what do you think it means? He wanted to be faithful to the law and not expose her to public disgrace.
I think those are two separate things.
Yeah.
He wanted to be
Yeah.
faithful to the law said he was so,
Right. Yeah, I was literally just now thinking maybe that and should be a but. he wanted to be faithful to the law, but not expose her to public disgrace. And so he wanted to divorce her quietly. But in a situation like that, because both of these people, again, what is their environment? What is their setting? In terms of, for instance, how many of you guys grew up in a small town? And when I say small, I mean like under 10,000. Okay. So I grew up in Houston, and there's nothing small about that. So these people, Mary and Joseph both come from essentially the sticks. They came from small towns. And so as you guys may well know, and Terry and I lived in a couple of places that were like 5,000 and under. And so as people are driving around town, people know where somebody is because of their vehicle. I know who drives that Chevy or, whatever the car is. I know where people are. And so I've always been curious not to expose her to public disgrace, but if you're going to divorce her, if you're going to cut off the engagement, and she's pregnant, so that there's really no way to get around, a type of public disgrace. So that's always been curious to me, and maybe something I look into.
Paul says that they were to be put to death.
Yeah.
Those that found to commit adultery. Now, under Roman rule, they weren't allowed to exercise that punishment.
Yeah.
But
What other shame might have been employed as a punishment?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but you're right. It's going to be known.
Yeah.
It's not going to be.
It's not something that you can do quietly. But then again, it's not so much that he was going to do it quietly, it's that his intention was not to, disgrace her, to embarrass. That was his intention. He didn't want to harm her, even though he was going to, cut off the engagement quietly. So after he considers this, what's really interesting, I don't know, something else interesting outside of all this is it's like a lot of other verses and a lot of other sections of the Bible. Generally, how well do you guys know this story? There's often stories. If I were to stand up here and talk about David and Goliath, you're already at the end. You know what's coming. And yet I would imagine for a lot of these stories that we know so well, we know them, dare I say, on a kind of a surfacey level. We know the story. But I don't know that we ever stop and camp out in certain places and really walk through some of this stuff. Because we know them, but I don't know that we have stopped and camped out at places. Yeah.
Jewish law at the time, it seems like the marriage was just a ceremony where she was betrothed to him. If the baby was Joseph's and they weren't married through a ceremony yet, did they frown on that, or were they considered married?
Yeah, that I understand, betrothing is not marriage, but it's as good as. And when you look at...
It was Joseph and Mary, just,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, and the reason for the disengaging, if you will, for the divorcing her, is because of a child, not because of Joseph, right? So and I think that's a cool question. The disgrace isn't the divorce, although that wouldn't be good. The disgrace is now Mary's pregnant. And who's the father and what's going on? Imagine going to Joseph and, in fact, going to her family. And this is one of the cool things to me about all of this is Mary but she's going to go to her family. And obviously in Luke, it hits on John the Baptist and Elizabeth and that whole conversation that they have. But she's going to go talk to people, her family, no doubt possibly Joseph. I'm pregnant, but I haven't had sex with anybody. So how are you pregnant? It's of the Holy Spirit. Now again, I don't know how they receive that. I know how we receive it today, but I don't know how they receive that. So and that's what I mean by, we know this story, but do we ever drop our brain into this culture, this setting, this moment for these people? Because they didn't live in a nicer area. These people lived in whatever you would call the sticks. To me, that's what we called it. And it wasn't a degrading term. It was just a very, very small town. That's where they lived. So everybody knew everybody. And not only did everybody know everybody in some way was connected. They're all Jewish, right? And so it's almost as if, you go to one of those towns where everybody in some way, they're either connected through brother, sister, through cousin, second cousin. Everybody knows everybody. And so again, I don't know exactly how he's going to put her away quietly, especially with this being of the Holy Spirit. So after he thinks about this, and I did look up the word consider because it is curious to me, and it was a process. It wasn't like he was like, what should I do? I mean, he thought about it, mulled over it. How do I divorce her without disgracing her? And while he's processing this, an angel of the Lord appears to him, a messenger of the Lord, in a dream. And for whatever reason, Matthew chooses to include a dream, and it may be because of Matthew's audience. The Jews were very much into dreams, and I don't know if you remember about a year ago, we went, we did like 3 months of dreams. And in the Old Testament, dreams were a big deal. Luke's audience, Gentiles, they maybe didn't care, so he doesn't include that Mary had a dream because Gentiles don't care. But for the Jews, if you have a dream from the Lord, it's a big deal. So a messenger of the Lord, and by the way, the word Lord there is not Yahweh or Adonai, it's Kurios, which is either master or sir. A messenger of the master, if you will, appears to him in a dream. And he says, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, or in Hebrew it is Joshua, same name, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, something else very curious here is we've in these two different paragraphs, we have, if you will, the narrator, which is Matthew, telling us what's happening here. That there is a pregnancy. It is of the Holy Spirit. What Joseph is possibly going to do or thinking about doing. And then what happens in the next paragraph? We get the same information, but it's now the angel telling Joseph in this dream what the situation is. Joseph, don't be afraid. And in our lesson today, we're going to get into this idea of fear, and it's a very, very interesting, curious thing. Do not be afraid. Do not flee. Do not be frightened by what's happening. So, to not get in the weeds too much, which I am very capable of doing, what would he be afraid of, Joseph? In terms of taking Mary on as his wife, what would be the fear?
People's opinions.
What's that?
People's opinions.
People's opinions, families' opinions. And as Mary's walking around, who's the husband or who's the dad? And I haven't looked enough into this to know. I don't know if they would even ask that. That it gets asked today. So what would the answer to that question be? Who's the dad? The Holy Spirit. God is the dad. We're going to call him Jesus. We're going to call him Joshua, essentially. So do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. So again, what the narrator tells us in the first paragraph, we get through this messenger in the second paragraph. And she's going to give birth to a son. So not only do they know that she's pregnant, but what else do they now know? Going to be a boy. And oftentimes, one of the, of course, now it's a big deal to do these gender reveals. So Joseph, and there's no way to know whether Joseph got his dream before Mary or vice versa. But Joseph knows now it's going to be a son. And not only is it going to be a son, but what else? The family's not going to name this child, much like Zechariah with John the Baptist. But the son is going to have a name. It's going to be given to him. Boy, I've never made that connection. That's interesting. Both Jesus and John both get named by an angel, or essentially by God. God's going to give them their name, as opposed to the family giving them their name. So how big of a deal is that? Because for this culture, names were a pretty big deal. And usually it was the father that named them. And so here, not only are you going to have a son, but the name is already there. And why is his name going to be Jesus? What he's going to accomplish. That's right. He will save his people from their sins. And I know you've heard this a gazillion times before. The name Jesus or Joshua, do you guys know what it means? God saves. So his name literally means he will save his people from his sins. So all this took place to fulfill what the Lord, again, sir or master, had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. As I was walking through this, again, it's one of those things that we know the story, but sometimes our challenge is we know the story so well. Do you know the next time that Jesus gets called Emmanuel? Anybody? Doesn't happen. They will call him Emmanuel. So why do you think this, that Matthew notates this? They will call him Emmanuel, or they refer to him as Emmanuel, which means God with us. Okay? Yeah, because they don't actually call him that. Nobody ever calls him that, at least not in terms of the narratives that we have with the Gospels. It's nowhere else except right here. But it may be more of a description as opposed to a name given. And when you look at this name Emmanuel, it literally means God with us, if you break this word down, which I know you guys are very curious to do. I'm kidding. I know you're not. But the name literally means God with us, the Hebrew of this word, or the Greek. So Joseph wakes up. He did what this messenger of the Lord had commanded him, and he took Mary home as his wife. And he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. And so, with this story, and of course, Luke tells the one of Mary and her situation, which we're going to look at for our lesson today. it's just interesting to me how this whole thing unfolds. And it's not like, at least that we know, that Joseph is this older guy that we know of. He's probably a younger guy and got this whole situation in front of him. And as he's getting there, and I think to Jonathan's point, if you find out the woman that you're engaged to, and all of a sudden you find out that she is pregnant, and all we know from this first paragraph is that we don't know that Joseph and Mary came together and had this conversation. And she's like, hey, here's what's going on, but I haven't been with the man. Or because the only reason for Joseph to know this is because an angel appears to him and shares what he needs to do. But Joseph already knows because of this first paragraph and what happens here. So any other thoughts, just in terms of this narrative and this whole story, in terms of what happens here with Joseph? Yeah.
Not so much on the Joseph side, but I'm kind of stuck on Emmanuel. So
I was too.
Yeah, it only appears in Isaiah and Matthew, but it is interesting. There's a little bit of a book in here because at the end of Matthew, Jesus says, Matthew quotes Jesus to say, behold, I'm with you into the end of the age. So that's kind of an interesting tie-in there, that it's not just, they didn't necessarily call him that, at least it's not recorded.
Not recorded.
But at the same time, that is what Jesus was. That's why he was there, to be with them while he was on this earth, and to be with them after he ascended. So, interesting tie-in.
Yeah. And there are other places where, in fact, if you're interested, I looked up Emmanuel in other places in the Bible, just simple as that. And it brought up, 20 different references. Most of them were the Old Testament. Obviously, Isaiah 7 comes up. But there are some in Psalms. There's one, I think, in Micah that says, God will be with you. That idea, which is what Emmanuel is. So Emmanuel isn't necessarily a name as it is an action, a presence. Emmanuel, God is with you. And so you have in these other places, and all of them are in the Old Testament, where do not fear, God is with you. I am here. Those types of ideas. And so it was just until it clicked with me, because I know this is here in Matthew 1. I was like, I wonder where else that is. And it's nowhere else, at least not in the New Testament. And possibly for this reason, because most of the prophecies we find from the Old Testament, Matthew makes a hard push for prophecies. Like a hard push. He has the boatload of prophecies of all the Jesus narratives. Luke has a decent amount, but not near the amount that Matthew does. And so for Matthew, pulling Isaiah 7 over is important. Luke doesn't do it. Why do you think Luke doesn't do it? Because the Gentile audience probably doesn't care. It's much like, and I was thinking about this example on the way here, that if I'm standing there talking to a guy, because I say a guy because usually it's a guy, and he says, hey, did you watch the football games yesterday? And I'm like, yeah, I actually didn't watch them, but I kept up with them. And I asked him, are you a big college football fan? No, I just kind of watch occasionally. So now I know that there's a whole conversation that's not going to be had because he really doesn't get into it. But if he says, man, yeah, I love it. Oh, man, what do you think about the NIL and the transfer portal and coaching this? And I'll start hitting stuff. And if he gets into it, then we talk a lot. if he's like, dude, I don't know what you're talking about, there goes that conversation. So for the Jews, they were very much into genealogy and into prophecy. And so Matthew puts that in here to connect those dots. For the Gentiles, it didn't matter, and especially it didn't matter for Mark, because he doesn't cover any of this stuff.
It's Jews.
Yes.
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 That's what Matthew's intent was.
Yes.
Yeah. It makes sense if it would include a lot of prophecy.
Right. Like a lot. Yeah. And in fact, for Matthew, and I want you guys to notice this, and maybe this is we'll close today, is that Matthew doesn't bring in prophecy. Matthew wants to hit all of these places and connect them with his book. So for Matthew, the starting is prophecy. It's not that he brings it in. It's that he's linking all of these things. So for the Jews, and I'm glad you said that because that's what I'm trying to say. For the Jews, here's this place, Isaiah 7. Here's this place in Psalm 2. Here's this place, etc., etc. And he's linking them to Jesus. The Gentiles don't care. Luke doesn't mess with it. The Romans definitely don't care. Mark doesn't mess with it. And John's doing a whole nother thing. So this is Joseph's interesting story. And if nothing else, maybe you'll dig into some of this a little bit more. And one last point. Notice in verse 20. Is that verse 20? Yeah. Goodness, 18 and 19 are long. Goodness, 20 is too. So, but after he considered this, a messenger of the Lord appeared to him, and what does he call Joseph, this messenger? Son of David. So for the Jews, was David kind of important? He was the important one outside of Moses. So he calls him Joseph, son of David, makes that connection. So notice here all of these connections that Matthew is making in terms of encouraging the Jews to know that Jesus is the Messiah. And he begins verse 18. This is the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, and how it came about. So Matthew is wanting to push that narrative. All right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. All right, well, thank you for your comments, and we'll see you next Sunday, and we'll hit another psalm.